Welcome back to our reflections on the Gospel, and we're reflecting on the Gospel of Luke today, and in particular the Passion story from chapters 22 to 24. And just a few thoughts, general thoughts about Luke's Passion. Luke stresses the innocence of Jesus. Pilate will stress it. Herod will see him as an innocent person. The thief on the cross will acknowledge that he's innocent. And the centurion, after he dies on the cross, says that he was innocent. So Luke is putting a lot of emphasis on innocence, even though it occurs in the other Gospels as well. He also puts in something a lot about compassion and forgiveness, which we've seen as being important to Luke. He heals the servant's ear in the garden when Peter actually cuts off the servant's ear. On the way to the cross, he talks to the women and talks about the future and how they're going to be affected by that. He prays on the cross, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." So, idea of compassion and forgiveness. And he says to the repentant thief, "Today you will be in paradise." So we can see that there are themes that run through the Passion account that really are very Lucan. Another thing that runs through is Jesus' trust in the Father. I think the Gethsemane scene is a very important one. Luke includes the fact that Jesus prays and an angel comes to comfort him, and he sweats, as it were, like drops of blood. And his prayer is, "Father, into your hands," on the cross, "Father, into your hands I commend my spirit." So that relationship with the Father that has been important in the Gospel and throughout all the Gospels comes through. Luke is much more gentle on the disciples. Mark is very harsh on the disciples. Matthew tempers it a bit. Luke is much more forgiving in doing it. So let's get down to the text and see what we've got to read here. The festival of the unleavened bread, called the Passover, was drawing near. It's important that we recognise the Passover. It was the time when the covenant of Israel with Yahweh was a covenant, and the sacrifice associated with it was dealt with. And that's what's going to happen, that this is a Passover event in the life of Jesus as well. So the chief priests and the scribes, they're looking for ways to do away with Jesus, and they're frightened of the people. In other words, they've got to find a way that doesn't involve doing anything before the people. So what then emerges is that Satan comes back. You might recall that in the temptation with Satan in the desert, that Jesus overcomes him, but the conclusion is that Satan goes away until he returns at the appointed time. So this is the appointed time for Luke. Then Satan entered into Judas. So clearly what's going to unfold is going to be the work of Satan. So Judas, one of the 12, there's a response there. One of the 12 goes to the high priest with a proposal that he will look for a way to hand Jesus over to them. People sometimes wonder how could he do that as an apostle, but nevertheless, sometimes people who are very close to Jesus fall away. That's the reality we call lukewarmness. And when people fall away in that way, they do things that would be equivalent to what Judas is doing. So they agree to give him money, and one of the Gospels talks about him as a person that used to take money from the common purse, so that could have been his motivation, and he was looking for an opportunity, and we'll see that he will find it. So the time came to celebrate the Passover meal. Jesus sends the disciples to a place where they can make preparations. This is a scene like we've seen before when Jesus entered Jerusalem. They went off and found a colt just as he had told them. So now they go off to find a place, and it's all there just as Jesus told them. So they set out at the supper. So when the time came, the apostles were with him. Notice the reference to the apostles being called apostles at this stage. And he says, I have heartily longed to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. So I think that's what's being said here, that really he's come to a climax. The time had come. The hour is the Greek word, and that means a sort of the actual time that was designated by God. And he acknowledges that he's looking forward to it actually taking place, and therefore eating with them before that time is important. And he will not eat again until it is fulfilled in the kingdom of God. So that's in the future. So then, taking a cup, he gave thanks. Take this and share it among you, because from now on I tell you, I shall never again drink from the fruit of the vine until the kingdom of God comes. So it's a time when the kingdom is to the fore, but it is going to come, and it is then that things are going to be important for the disciples and for those who are followers of Jesus. The cup being mentioned here, only Luke mentions this cup. He's going to go on now to talk about the cup, which we associate with the Eucharist. Then he took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and gave it to them, saying, This is my body given for you. Do this in remembrance of me. The other synoptics talk about the body given for many. Luke talks about it as given for you. Recall that in the Beatitudes, Matthew talks about the poor in spirit. Luke says, Blessed are you poor. Matthew talks about those who hunger and thirst after righteousness. Luke says, Blessed are you who are hungry. So a much more direct approach. And do this in remembrance of me. This is going to be a covenant meal. And a covenant meal is something that is meant to be repeated. So what Jesus is doing here is making present the mystery of his salvation, of the salvation, of his sacrifice, and that is to be carried on. It is carried on for us in the Eucharist. So after the cup, similarly, he says, This cup is the new covenant in my blood poured out for you. So there are a definite reference to the covenant, that just as the Passover meal celebrated the sacrifice that was made by Moses to bring about the initial covenant, so now Jesus offers a new sacrifice, his sacrifice, to bring about a new covenant. It's his blood that brings that about, and that's why it's something to be carried through. He foretells the treachery of Judas. Notice he talks about the Son of Man there is going as it is decreed. In other words, fulfillment is important in the Passion narrative. We'll see that basically the true understanding of the Passion narrative can only be understood if we understood how Jesus, the Messiah, is presented in the Old Testament. So they began to question each other, which of them who it could be. So at this stage, it isn't clear to them who is going to portray Jesus. They then begin to talk about who is going to be the greatest. Only Luke includes this at the Last Supper, and it occasions words that we do find elsewhere in the other Gospels about how the rulers of the Gentiles lorded over people, but that's not the way that they are to do it. The greatest among them must be the youngest, and the leader is the one who serves. He gives them a little image there, which I think is a wonderful one. He says, who is greater, the one at table or the one who serves? And he answers the question, the one at table, surely. And then says, yet I am among you as one who serves. Luke doesn't record the washing of the feet, as does John, but it's the same message coming through, that basically Jesus has come as the one who serves. The Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve. So after that, he talks about the reward that will be given to those who have been with him. And he confers a kingdom on them, just as a father conferred one on me. So the new kingdom that is to come, they are going to be part of that, and they will have an important place of judgment in what is to come. Jesus then looks ahead to the denial of Peter. And notice Satan gets a mention again. Look, Simon, Simon, look, Satan has been granted to sift you like wheat, but I have prayed for you. Why did Simon fall, as it were? Well, he gave in to temptation, and Jesus is making the point that his prayer is what will bring him through that failure to the role that he's going to play in the future. And sometime you must turn back and strengthen your brothers. So he's acknowledging that Satan will tempt Peter, that Peter will fail, but his prayer will bring Peter back to care for those around him. And Peter refuses to accept that, and Jesus affirms that the cock will not crow today before you have denied me 3 times. He then said to them, he's talking about sending them out, and he recalls that he already sent them out, telling them to leave everything behind and just get out there. But here he says, but now is the important word there, everyone who has a purse should take it, and the same with the bag. Anyone who has no sword should sell his tunic and buy one. For I say to you that this scripture must be fulfilled in me. In other words, I think all that's pointing to, not so much that there's going to be a sword fight, but that there's going to be a time of opposition, a very difficult time. He quotes Isaiah, where it says that he's going to be reckoned among the lawless, like the 2 criminals who are crucified with him. And what is written about me, he says, is being fulfilled. So while the disciples are not really understanding what's taking place, it's all taking place according to the plan of God. And of course they don't understand, so they jump in with their swords and thinking that it's going to be a material fight, and the Lord says that is enough. So they go off now to the Mount of Olives. In the other 2 synoptics, on the way to the Olives, Jesus and they talk about that all of them will leave Jesus and go away. Luke doesn't have those words of Jesus there. As I've mentioned, he's much more gentle in relationship to the disciples. So when he gets there at the garden, he says, pray that you do not enter into temptation. I just wanted to mention those words, as usual. In other words, this was something that Jesus did regularly, and of course this is how Judas is going to be able to bring the high priest to arrest him, because he knows the practice of Jesus, and this is going to be the place where it takes place. So Jesus withdraws from them and kneels down and prays, Father, if you are willing, take this cup away from me, yet not my will, but yours be done. He said elsewhere, if anyone will come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. Well, that's what Jesus does. He denies himself, doing something that he would rather not do, but doing it because it is the will of the Father. I think it's important to understand Calvary in light of the garden. I often say that it's harder to make a decision to do something than it is to actually do it. Because once you make the decision and make up your mind that you're going to really do it, then you marshal all your enemies and do it. And I think what's happening here is that Jesus, facing up to the difficulty that is before him, makes a decision that he's going to go on because this is the way the Father has asked him to go. Not that the Father sent him to die on the cross, but the Father sent him to preach the kingdom. And the cross is the cross is the cost of that. In other words, because he goes on preaching it, then he is going to die on the cross. Only Luke talks about the angel coming and his sweat becoming like drops of blood. So he then goes back and he finds the disciples sleeping from grief. They often seem to have difficulty being awake. You might remember at the Transfiguration, they were sleepy in the midst of that great event. And here they are the same. Luke doesn't recall that Jesus goes back 3 times, but he just goes back the once and finds them sleeping. And his word, why are you asleep? Get up and pray that you do not enter into temptation. So it's a significant event. The sleeping, as we've seen, is really a reference to a lack of faith. They have not yet understood what exactly is going to happen. Then while he's speaking, the crowd suddenly appears. And the crowd is made up of Judas, his disciple, and the people from the high priests. And Jesus puts into words what all of the synoptics say Judas does. Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss? Notice the title Son of Man, the title Jesus uses very often in terms of his mystery and the suffering that is involved in that ministry. So the disciples immediately jump to the defense of Jesus. One of them strikes a high priest's servant and cuts off his ear. The Gospel of John tells us that Peter. But at this, Jesus said, leave it at that. And touching his ear, he healed him. Only Luke records the fact that Jesus heals the ear of the servant of the high priest. So then they go off to the chief priests and the officers of the guard and the elders who had come with him. Have you come with swords and clubs as though I were a bandit? He acknowledges that he was in the temple with them, but they didn't lift a hand against him, and we know why, because they were frightened of the response of the people. But Jesus points out this is your hour, the hour that so often represents the divine time, and it's the time for the reign of darkness. So what is to unfold is part of darkness. So they take him to the high priest's house, and Peter follows at a distance. So Peter, still loyal, going after Jesus. The other Gospels record that at the garden, all the disciples flee. Luke does not record that. Again, he's a bit more gentle in dealing with the disciples. So on a number of occasions there, people confront Peter, and he constantly denies that he was with Jesus or that he belongs to the followers of Jesus. And when that happens a third time, immediately while he was still speaking, the cock crowed. And the next verse is one that we only find in Luke. And the Lord turned and looked straight at Peter. And Peter remembered the Lord's words when he had said to him, before the cock crows today, you will deny me 3 times. So a very moving moment in the Gospel where Peter is confronted. Perhaps confront is not the right word. There's compassion, I think, in the look of Jesus, and he has prayed that Peter will go on to have an important role. So he goes out and he weeps bitterly. So in the meantime, Jesus is being knocked. They blindfold him and question him. They treat him as a prophet, and they keep heaping all sorts of insults at him. So the one who really is to be esteemed above all is being treated in a very inadequate way. The next incident is when he comes before the chief priest, the Sanhedrin. Notice it's the elders of the people, the chief priests and the scribes. So it's the official crowd that he's standing before now. And they're asking, are you the Messiah? And Jesus says, if I tell you, you will not believe. And if I question you, you will answer. But from now on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of the power of God. So in a sense, that's yes. And that's the way that the Jewish leaders take it. And they say, so you are the Son of God. And he replies, you say that I am. And that's an affirmation. So they say then, that's blasphemy. Why do we still need any evidence? And of course, it's an interesting little statement because we know from the other synoptics that they had difficulty finding the evidence to actually make a conclusion. And it's only when Jesus acknowledges who he is that they then declare that this is blasphemy and find something that they can judge him for. So they then rise and take Jesus before Pilate. And it's important, the Jews could not put Jesus to death. They could punish him, they could whip him and do all sorts of things, but they're taking him to Pilate. And they accuse him, and they accuse him as being a political problem. In other words, he's inciting the people to revolt. He's saying don't pay taxes to Caesar. They're claiming he's a king, and of course even just claiming to be a king was a political nightmare at this time of the Romans. So Pilate says, "Are you the king of the Jews?" He says, "You say so." So Pilate then turns to the people and says, "I find no case against this man." So again, the innocence of Jesus is what is taking place here. But they affirm all of the things that they said before, and they mention Galilee. And Pilate jumps into that. If he's a Galilean, he can go to Herod, because Herod has responsibility over the people in Galilee, and he's in Jerusalem at the time. So Jesus is taken to Herod, and Herod is someone that's been wanting to talk to Jesus or to see Jesus, more, I think, out of curiosity than anything else. I don't think we have that scene with Pilate. Anyway, the scene with Herod is only in Luke, and it's not important in a sense it adds much, but it adds to Luke's emphasis that there's no crime against Jesus. Herod, who could well have declared something, certainly doesn't do that. So they bring Jesus back to Pilate, and what we have there then is they want him to release, or he wants to release Jesus again. Again, an emphasis on the fact that he is innocent. But they, and the they is important. Who is the they? I think it is the leaders of the government and the Jewish administration, but also the people gathered round them. Sometimes people contrast the crowd that welcomed Jesus to Jerusalem and this crowd that wants to crucify him. I think they're different crowds. Luke refers to the crowd welcoming Jesus as disciples. Here we've got a group of people that are clearly influenced by the high priest. So they're a group that are associated with the high priest. Pilate resists again. He finds nothing there, but they insist, and they insist that he should be crucified. So eventually Pilate gives in. He releases Barabbas, and he hands Jesus over to them as they wished. So really it's making the point that the whole scene was orchestrated by the Jewish leaders. Now I think that brings us to the end, close to the end of chapter 22. Let me just check I know there's just a little bit more. We'll do that. On the way to Calvary, there's a few interesting things there. Notice how Luke brings in a few different people. Simon, who is seized to carry the cross. The women who are there to mourn for Jesus, and we'll see the thief on the cross. The universalism that Luke's interested in comes out. Jesus' message to the women is one of compassion, that really, if things are happening to him as the one who deserves to be the king, what's it going to be like when punishment comes upon those who have rejected him? And he warns them and suggests that really it's going to be a very difficult time. For if they do this when the wood is green, what will they do when it's arid? Meaning that here it is in the time of Jesus, and this is happening to him. What will happen to Jerusalem for the things that they have done in refusing Jesus? Luke adds about the two criminals, which sets the scene for what happens on Calvary. Now, I think we might just leave that there and just ask for any questions that might come through. I think there is a question here. A question about the Passover. Why does Jesus choose the Passover? I think I've mentioned that. This was the time of the covenant and the sacrifice for the covenant, and that's what's actually taking place here. And that the reference, "this is my body given for you," that is sacrificial language. It's the covenant sacrifice that is beginning the coming of the kingdom. Why does Jesus pray so intensely to the Father before his arrest? I think that he is acknowledging that he's going to do what the Father asks, but that really it's the Father being with him that is important. In the Gospel of John, when the disciples leave Jesus, Jesus says, "I am not alone, the Father is with me." And I think we need to see Calvary as the Father present there. In other words, the relationship between Jesus and the Father is what Calvary is about. Do we have any other questions? Yes, that's a question. I mentioned the significance of the Passover. I think it's a time because it remembers the covenant and the sacrifice that sealed it. And what Jesus is saying, there's a new covenant, and it's my sacrifice that seals it. The words are not used in Luke, but in the other synopsis, Jesus says, "Take and eat, take and drink." Now that's not saying this will nourish you. No, it's a question, are you willing to be part of the new covenant that is actually being established by my sacrifice? So the Passover context is extremely important because it just gives meaning. I can remember the time when people used to fight over whether the Eucharist was a sacrifice or a meal. And of course the answer was that it's both a meal and a sacrifice. But the real question is, what sort of a meal and what sort of a sacrifice? It's a covenant meal and a covenant sacrifice, and that's why it's important that it took place at the time of the Passover. Let's just move on. We got to the stage of Jesus on the way to Calvary, and now we've come up with the crucifixion itself. So they seized Simon, we've seen that, and they come to Calvary. When they reach the place called the Skull, they crucified him, and the criminals, one on his right and on his left. Notice there's a Lucan insert here, the prayer of Jesus. "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." Right, that compassion that we mentioned is part of Luke's passion narrative, being more gentle on the disciples, being gentle with the thief on the cross. So Jesus, in the face of all this, is praying for those who are crucifying him. This is really a concrete example of love your enemies that he has preached in his mission. So they cast lots to share his clothing. That was probably a common practice, but it's presented here in terms of Psalm 22. In other words, it's another reference to the fact that what was taking place is something that was foretold. Why are people surprised? This was going to happen. It's just that people didn't realize it. So the people stood watching. Notice the people here have a passive role. The priests, the leaders, they're going to scoff at Jesus, and the soldiers are going to mock him, and one of the thieves is going to mock him. But the people are just watching. And we'll see in a moment further down, they'll go away beating their breasts. So you sort of feel that the people here have not really been as involved in what has been taking place as the Jewish leaders who had perhaps motivated them and urged them on to what they did. This incident about the good thief is only in Luke. "Are you not the Messiah? Save yourself," says the bad thief. And the other rebukes him and says, "Do you not fear God, since you are under the same sentence? And we justly." Notice another reference to the innocence of Jesus. They are getting what they deserve, but this man did nothing wrong. So a constant reference to the innocence of Jesus. And he asks to be remembered, and Jesus says that he will be with him today, on that day in paradise. So it's about noon, and darkness came over the whole land until mid-afternoon, and the sun's light failed. A sort of a cosmic reaction, representing what Jesus said. This is the hour of darkness that he spoke of when in the garden. So I think it's capturing the evil character of what has taken place. And the curtain of the temple was torn right down the middle. The curtain was the one that separated the holy place from the rest, as it were. And now it's torn apart. I think, again, a reference to Luke's emphasis that what Jesus has to say was for all. Jesus then cries out in a loud voice, "Father, into your hands I commend my spirit." Only in Luke does Jesus say this. and it's in Psalm 31. Psalm 31, like Psalm 21, Father, why have you abandoned me, as the other synoptics record, they're both really psalms of confidence in God. So I don't think it's surprising that Jesus, as a good Jew, would be praying in the language of the Psalms on the cross. Now the centurion there, he says, truly this was a just man. The other two synoptics say, this was the Son of God. But in terms of Luke's emphasis on the innocence of Jesus, again an affirmation that he was an innocent man that had been killed. And notice the crowds who were there for the spectacle, they went home beating their breasts. So it's quite an interesting presentation of Calvary. It's Satan coming to the fore. It's tempting Jesus because the leaders say, if you are the Son of God, come down from the cross. Well, that's the sort of temptation that Jesus experienced when he fought with Satan in the desert. And now we've got the crowd here clearly not rejoicing at what has taken place, but rather repenting. And the last words there, all his friends stood at a distance. All his friends. I think we have to include the disciples there. Remember that in the other synoptics they were sort of excluded. But I think what we've got is the friends of Jesus, the disciples, the women, all being there, but probably watching from afar as they might have had to do. So we come to the stage of the burial of Jesus. So Joseph of Arimathea, a member of the council, a good and righteous man, and he goes and gets permission from Pilate to actually take down the body of Jesus, and he takes it and places it in a tomb, and the women who had followed Jesus see where where it is, and because the Passover is about to follow the Sabbath day, they rested, but they prepared spices so that they would go to the tomb and anoint the body of Jesus. We might pause there again. That's the end of chapter 23. Just a moment for questions, if you have any questions. There was a question that has come up. Why do they emphasise that Jesus should die, even though Pilate can't find any reason for it? I think the trial really has to be seen within the conflict of Jesus as the Messiah and the Jewish leadership that is rejecting it. And Jesus attacks them and points out their inadequacies. So really, they just want to put Jesus out of action. So they want him to be crucified. So I think it's important to recognise that their motivation has got nothing to do with whether or not he's innocent or guilty. In their mind, he's innocent because he pretends that he is the Son of God and that he is the Messiah. Well, let's go on now just to talk about what happens after that. We come now to the empty tomb scene, and the empty tomb scene is an interesting one. The women go there. There seems to have been a few of them, not just the key ones that are mentioned a little bit later, but they come and they find that the stone has been rolled away. That looks like a normal sentence, but very often when the passive is used in the Greek language in the Gospels, it means that there's been a divine intervention. So the use of the Passion is sort of saying God did it. So they find that the stone is rolled away and they could not find the body of the Lord Jesus. And as they were doing it, two men in dazzling clothes. The dazzling clothes are a bit like Jesus at the Transfiguration, representing the true glory that these people represent. Seeing them, we would call them angels, I think, and they are suddenly standing beside them. And they're terrified, which is the normal response that we find in the scriptures to those in the divine presence. And they speak, "Why are you looking for the living among the dead?" Right? In other words, Jesus is alive. He is not here. He has been raised up. That can be translated in many ways, but I think he has been raised up is pointing again to the divine action that has taken place. Remember what he told you while he was still in Galilee. and records that the prophecies of the Passion. There were 3 of them, and they remember his words. And they went back from the tomb and told the 11 and all the others. And you could imagine they would have been happy about that. But they didn't believe them. They thought it sounded like an idle tale. And what we're experiencing here is that the resurrection was not really expected by the disciples of Jesus, even though they acknowledge that he did speak about the resurrection. They just did not understand what was intended by that. And so what happens, Peter rushes to the tomb and goes to the tomb. He sees the linen cloths lying there, but nothing else. Then he went back home amazed at what had happened. Amazed, we've seen often that amazed is different to faith, that you can be amazed at something without having faith. And I think it's pointing to the fact that even Peter here has not yet come to that faith in the resurrection. And then we have this wonderful scene on the road to Emmaus. These 2 disciples walking along, and their problem is that they're trying to reconcile 2 things. They believed that Jesus was the Messiah, but he'd just been crucified, and crucified by the Jewish authorities, which sort of added to the fact that that seems contrary to him being the Messiah. And so Jesus begins to talk with them. He listens to what they have to say, but he then goes on to talk to them about the scriptures. And these 2 acknowledge that the women had found the tomb empty. But Jesus goes on and says, "How foolish you are, so slow to believe all that the prophets said." In other words, why are you upset? Don't you know that the prophet said this was going to happen? Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer and so enter into his glory? So clearly they hadn't read the Old Testament in this way. And starting from Moses and from all the prophets, he explained to them the passages about himself throughout the scriptures. So that explaining of the scriptures is really a key aspect of the resurrection. It's going to occur again in a few moments when we talk about the Jesus appearing to the disciples. And what's being said here is that the Old Testament has to be read in the light of the resurrection of Jesus. In other words, the New Testament is not just completely separate and totally different. No, the roots of it are in the Old Testament. And in the New Testament, the Old Testament has come to fulfillment. So when they get there, they press him, Jesus, to stay. They haven't recognized him. I think that's another lack of faith situation. In other words, they had not yet come to that stage where they could recognize him. But in the breaking of the bread, which is what our Eucharist, they actually do recognize him, and they rush back to tell the others what they have heard, and talk about the fact that their hearts were burning within them as he opened his scriptures to us. I think the important thing about the road to Emmaus is that the scriptures are the key to understanding what has taken place in the death of Jesus. So they returned to Jerusalem. They found the 11 all together, and they said, "The Lord has indeed risen and has appeared to Simon." So they're believing now. They didn't believe the women, but obviously they're believing Simon. So they recounted what happened and how they had recognized him at the breaking of the bread. So they were still talking about this when Jesus himself stood among them. They were there in a room. It's not as if Jesus came in through the door. It's clear from the other synoptics that this is an appearance of Jesus, and his message to get to them is peace. And they too are frightened again in the presence of what clearly is a divine situation. And he upbraids them to a certain extent about the misgivings that were rising in their hearts. And he points to the sufferings of his hands and his feet, and he wants to prove to them that he is risen, so that they could not believe it, as it were. And he then eats something to prove that it is him who is there in his presence. So the first thing about this appearance to the disciples is clearly establishing that it is Jesus who has risen. But then we're now at verse 44. Then he told them, "This is what I said to you while I was still with you, that everything written about me in the law of Moses, in the prophets, and in the Psalms must be fulfilled." And then he opened their minds to the scriptures. When we appreciate what the Lord is saying here, it makes us realize that we haven't given the appropriate importance to the scriptures. Saint Jerome had the famous saying, "Ignorance of the scriptures is ignorance of Jesus." And yet we haven't been a Catholic people that encouraged the people to read the scriptures. We talked about the scriptures, but of course now, after the Vatican Council, that is what is being said. So the important message that Jesus is giving in this event is that he's alive, that he has risen, but he's making the point that what happened, really they should have expected that to happen. So what happens then? He says that what they should have known, that in his name repentance for the forgiveness of sins should be preached to all nations, beginning from Jerusalem. Beginning from Jerusalem is important. Remember, Luke has a special interest in Jerusalem. Jerusalem is the place where the events have taken place. And we'll see that the Gospel of Luke began in Jerusalem, in the temple, and the very last verses that we'll see in a minute end with the temple and in the city of Jerusalem. So he's now sending them what the Father has promised. So they are to stay in the city. In the other synoptics, they're to go to Galilee, as the Lord said that they should do, but they are to wait there until the power has come from on high. So they go out as far as Bethany, and Jesus blesses them, and as he blesses them, he withdraws from them and is carried up into heaven. I always like to think that this ascension scene is reminiscent of the scene where Elijah is raised up into heaven on a fiery chariot, and his prophet disciple Elijah sees it. And Elisha wanted twice the prophetic spirit that Elijah had, and Elijah said, "If you see me being taken up to heaven, you will have twice that prophetic spirit." And I think here we've got the ascension, Jesus rising up, the disciples witnessing that, and that sort of almost a commissioning, as it were, to go on and fulfill his ministry when the Spirit comes. The Gospel ends with the ascension, and the Acts of the Apostles will begin with the ascension. So notice the final scene. They worshipped him, they now recognized his true worth, and they went back to Jerusalem with great joy, and they were continually in the temple praising God. So the temple is like bookends in which the whole unfolding of the divine event has taken place. So let's pause there just for a moment and see if there are any questions. It's a question there about the opening of one's minds to the scriptures. I don't think we can emphasize that enough today, that our people is not a people who know the scriptures. They often know about them. We used to talk about Bible history rather than taking people to the scriptures, even though the scriptures were read in the liturgy. But I think the point being made is that familiarity with the scriptures is familiarity with the divine event that has taken place in Jesus. And we need to make that part of our life so that whatever we do is influenced by what has taken place in the life of Jesus as it's told in the scriptures. We don't have any other questions, so thank you for being with us. This concludes our commentary on Luke. I hope that has been helpful. It's a wonderful gospel. And next week we're going to begin with the Gospel of John. We've been looking at 3 synoptic gospels, called synoptic because, generally speaking, they represent the same tradition with additions. But in John we have a different tradition, and I think you'll find new insights into the mystery that unfolds in the life of Jesus as it is presented in the Gospel of John. So thank you for being with us.